Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Helen Soslowski. I'm the events director for Oblong Books. Before I welcome our guests this evening, I have a few instructions for those of you who have not attended one of our virtual events before. If you have questions at any time during the presentation, you can type them in the chat, which you'll find at the right-hand side of your screen. Some of you who haven't got that made visible, it'll say something nice or view chat. If you click on that, the chat bar will appear on the right and you can see everybody's questions. There's also a little module at the bottom of the screen that says ask a question. You can fill your questions in there and we'll address them at the end of the program. For those of you who'd like to purchase a copy, a signed copy of either Eva and Eve or House of Sticks, there's a green buy the book button right at the bottom of your screen, right below the authors. If you prefer to listen to your books, there's also a link to purchase the audiobook of both books in the chat module. So here we go. We're delighted to be hosting authors Julie Metz and Ly Tran this evening to celebrate and learn about their respective new memoirs. I'll start with Julie. Julie Metz is the New York Times best-selling author of Perfection. She's written for the New York Times, Salon, Dame, Red Book, and Glamour, and has received fellowships at Yaddo, the MacDowell Colony, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Vermont Studio Center. Her memoir, Eva and Eve, A Search for My Mother's Lost Childhood and What War Left Behind, interweaves personal memoir with family history, revealing both the resilience of her mother, who endured a harrowing childhood in Nazi-occupied Vienna, and the sacrifices that ordinary people are called upon to make during history's darkest hours. Joining Julie tonight is author Ly Tran. Ly holds a degree in creative writing and linguistics from Columbia University. She has also received fellowships from MacDowell, Art Omi, and Yaddo. Her memoir, House of Sticks, is her first book. In it, Ly adeptly weaves together the story of her family's immigration experience, making the difficult journey from Vietnam to Queens, with her own fraught and often challenging coming of age. House of Sticks is a timely and powerful portrait of Ly's struggle to reckon with her heritage and forge her own path. Welcome to you both. It's wonderful to have you with us this evening. Ly is going to start us off by reading and sharing insights into her book, followed by Julie, who will do the same, to give us all an introduction to their stories before they begin the conversation portion of the program. So without any further ado, Ly, I'm going to hand over to you, and Julie and I will disappear for a little while.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Oblong Books for hosting us tonight. It's such an honor to be here. Before I begin reading, I just wanted to give you all a little bit of context into the section that I'm reading. When I was 3 years old, my family and I immigrated from Vietnam to New York, and this is in 1993. And, you know, it was really difficult for us to make ends meet. And my first job here in America was when I was 3, and it was sweatshop labor, making ties and cummerbunds with my family for a very little pay. It was, you know, every 24 ties we made, we would earn $1. And this is what I would do from the age of 3 to about 13. And the section that I'm reading is my family and I taking a break from that work and venturing out into the city for the first time and going to Coney Island. We followed the throng of beachgoers across the wooden boardwalk to the edge of the sand, where all of us except my mother took off our shirts. It was the first time I had ever seen the ocean, its limitlessness at once awe-inspiring and frightening. Barefoot and wearing nothing but a pair of red cotton shorts, I skidded across the sand with my brothers. My feet burned, pain giving way to exhilaration and the promise of cool water. Hundreds of people crowded the section of sand right at the water's edge. We zigzagged around them until we found an opening where we could claim our own little plot of land. As soon as we marked our territory with our towels, my brothers and I ran straight to the water, our parents trailing after us. I watched as my brothers tentatively walked into the white froth of the waves, their faces lighting up as though seeing an old friend after a long period of absence. "So cold," they shouted gleefully, splashing each other. After a few minutes of shivering discovery, Tin was the first to dunk his body beneath the water, emerging seconds later, hair dripping and a big grin on his face to let us know that it was safe. "Don't go far," my father called out to them. "Stay between the lady right there on the right with the blue umbrella and that man over there with the green and yellow towel." He was like a referee, blowing an imaginary whistle each time one of them ventured too deep into the water or stepped outside the boundaries he set. Every now and then, he would stand waist deep in the water and stick his head under, then straighten back up and rub the water all over his body, as though showering in the sunlight with seawater as soap. I stood by the ocean's edge, digging my feet into the sand, instinctively aware of the dangers of the cold, murky water, which even a few feet from shore was so deep that I wouldn't be able to stand with my head above it. I bent down and grabbed a handful of gray, wet sand, kneading the strange stuff onto my body. My mother appeared at my side. "Didi Gong," she said, coaxing me farther into the water. "Don't be scared." She crouched down, and when I climbed onto her back, she paddled out to my brothers, with me clinging desperately to her neck. The water was calm and peaceful, with only small waves, and I soon relaxed into feeling safe and secure on my mother's back. Looking around, I saw other children playing nearby, and I wondered what their lives were like, wondered if they were also done with their quota of ties and cummerbunds for the week and were taking a break at the beach like we were. The air was cool, the sun suddenly hidden behind clouds. When a breeze blew by, I felt the hairs on my arm rise, goosebumps spreading across my body. Somehow, it was warmer to be in the water than outside of it. And my mother walked in deeper, taking me with her until I was fully immersed, except for my head. We all stayed in the water until our lips turned blue. 5 more minutes, Fu begged when my mother and father began reeling us in. But we were cold, and we knew the journey home was long, so none of us protested further when our 5 minutes were up. We made the trek home in a blissful state of sun and water-induced languor, having experienced for the first time in our lives an ocean, not knowing, as our parents did, the oceans we had already crossed to get there. That night, I went to bed feeling the ebb and flow of the waves around my body. I closed my eyes and I imagined it all over again, my day at the beach. Thank you.
Okay, and hi there. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much to Oblong Books for having us. And I will read a short selection from the beginning of my book. This is sort of the inciting incident, I guess I would say, the moment of discovery. I found an object after my mother died that actually was the inspiration to continue my research and write the book. So I'll read from that portion. In the back of the drawer where my mother kept her perfume-scented silk slips and nightgowns, I found a small book bound in coffee-colored linen. Pasted in the center was a lithograph of 2 kittens with red and pink ribboned collars. The word Poesie was stamped on the linen in faded gold ink. Inside were handwritten notes, all in German, addressed to Eva, or sometimes Avi, with dates from November 28, 1938, to March 24, 1940, the day before my mother and her parents left Vienna for the United States. My father came into the room and I held out the book. "Have you ever seen this? Do you know what it is?" He said he'd never seen it before, not once during all the decades of their marriage. My sister-in-law, Mary, had studied German and was able to decipher some of the old-fashioned script. Messages of love and farewell from childhood friends and older relatives, sometimes accompanied by famous verses from the poet Goethe. One page was filled with girlish drawings of hearts and colorful stickers of children in traditional Austrian costume. "Do not forget me, your loving friend Sylvie." On one spread from 1939, a girl named Renata had copied the characters from Disney's Three Little Pigs from a movie advertisement in colored pencil. Across the spread, she'd lettered the line, "Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?" There was indeed a terrifying big bad wolf in Vienna by January 12, 1939. His name was Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of Adolf Hitler's final solution, which would nearly obliterate European Jewry by the time the Nazis surrendered in 1945. My father looked over my shoulder, voicing what I suspected. Some, perhaps most of the people who had signed this keepsake book, those who did not get out of Vienna by October 1941, when the German government forbade immigration, must have perished. By the time my mother left with her parents, it had been almost too late. Who were all these people? Aunts and uncles, family friends, teachers, other girls who may not have reached adulthood. As I turned the fragile pages, I was saddened but not surprised that my mother had never shared this most private journal with her family. Ava had escaped and lived. She had become Eve. She'd found love, married, worked, created a family. She had become an American. But how had her family gotten out? And had she felt guilt for surviving? And then I'd just like to share with you, this is what the little book looks like. It's a little keepsake book. They were very popular with girls in the 1920s and 30s in Austria. And so now I think we'll begin our questions. And I wanted to ask Ly to talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book.
I'm sure. So, mine is ultimately a story of struggle and perseverance. And I think I wanted to tell my story for those who have been through similar hardships and who feel alone in their hardships. I myself struggled for a really long time on my own, not knowing who to turn to oftentimes or if my story was to be believed. When I was 8 years old, the school nurse sent me home from school with a letter asking my parents to get me glasses because I was nearsighted. And my father, who served nearly a decade in the re-education camps of Vietnam, thought glasses were a government conspiracy to take away my eyesight. So he forbid me from ever wearing glasses. And, this was something that I had to live with for the next 10 years of my life. It was my own imprisonment, so to speak. And I was so scared of telling anyone because I didn't know any better. And I thought that my story wasn't really worth telling. And it was such a bizarre thing to say anyway. And then I remember in the 9th grade reading Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. And it was about a little Black girl who yearned for a new pair of eyes. And it made me feel so seen. It was the first book to ever move me to tears. And I think it was because I saw myself in Pecola Breedlove, who wanted a new pair of eyes, albeit for very different reasons. But it really resonated with me. So sitting in a puddle of my own tears, I remember wishing that I could one day do that for someone else with my story. Another girl who was going through what I was going through, perhaps, and doubted herself. And that thought is what eventually led to this memoir. Yeah. And what about you? What inspired you to write yours?
Well, the section that I read talks a little bit about it. My mother and I had a kind of difficult relationship over the years. There was conflict. I knew that it had a lot to do with her immigrant experience. I knew that she had experienced terrible hardship back in Europe when she was a very young child. Not as young as when you came over. She was, the crisis in Austria started when she was about 9.5, but still a very young child. And then they were abruptly torn from their country, of course, very lucky to have gotten that at all. And they arrive in New York. They've lost everything and have to start over. In many ways, I think your story and my mother's story, there's a lot of connection there. So it was really after my mother died, I really felt that I hadn't had an opportunity to hear the story because there were a lot of things that she clearly chose not to share with her family. And I wanted to see if I could find out those stories. And in the same way, I think as you, I think there's so many people who come here and don't feel seen. And the story of immigration is eternal for Americans. I mean, that is what we are. We're just a nation of people who came from somewhere else. Yeah. So I wanted to that end, I've always been very curious about the title of your book, and if you could talk a little bit about that, what that title signifies for you, and why you chose it.
Sure. Well, I wanted a title that reflected the myriad themes of this memoir, themes of immigration, of poverty, of faith. And so this title actually has several different meanings. The first of which is that we came from a house made out of sticks and leaves in Vietnam. And we immigrated here to America with all the hopes of attaining the American dream, only to become the sticks ourselves. We were so emaciated, so impoverished. And, there were sometimes days when all we had to eat was, half a bowl of rice with soy sauce.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first meaning. And the second meaning actually relates to what you were reading about in that section. So it's about the three little pigs.
Yeah.
The second house, the house made out of sticks, I feel is a house that not a lot of people pay attention to. It's often the house of straw and the house of bricks. But I think that can be likened to the immigrant experience. Oftentimes we hear about the immigrants coming here and we hear about the immigrant success story, but we don't really know how hard won that success story is, and how flimsy a foundation that can be. Yeah. And then the third meaning has to do with faith, and it has to do with the sticks of incense that burned daily on our altar. Whenever we were going through really dark times, whenever I was going through dark times, I would turn to my Buddhist faith and try to just get through and hope that there was light on the other side. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very layered title. Yeah. I didn't think about, I know because you've told me where you grew up, and it's always amazing to think about, you started your life by the side of a river, 10,000 miles from here, and now here you are. And I think it's, for my mother, the journey wasn't as long, but it was in many ways quite as shocking that, they left a quite gracious city to move to New York City, which is not exactly welcoming. Do you know what I mean? In the sense of it's a tough town, and you come here, and I think also often with your family, immigrants really just get kind of dropped in place, and you're expected to figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your quest to really discover your mother's past and her journey here.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is your second memoir, and we both know how memory can be. And
Yeah.
there are memories that exist in others' minds that we only have access to through storytelling. And I know for me, there are points in my book where I would recount someone else's memory as told to me. And what I found most interesting about your memoir is that there are some sections that were fictionalized, and I'm curious as to why you made that choice.
Yeah, so I did a lot of research for my book. I knew quite a bit about the period, but because my mother didn't share all her stories, I realized I was going to have to do a lot of very intensive research. And then I discovered that there were 2 years that I knew I was sort of on shaky ground. And those were the years between 1938 and 1940, when the family was still in Vienna, but my uncles had been sent away to London to be safer with some relatives. So unfortunately, after my mother died, I couldn't ask my uncles what those 2 years had been like, because they weren't there anymore. So at a certain point, I found there were kind of holes in the narrative, and that I was going to have to take a leap of narrative faith. And I thought, let me do my research the best I can and feel that I'm on solid ground. And then I'm going to have to use my imagination to recreate the flavor and the feeling of this time. Also, the time a little bit before that, where, 1928 in Vienna, there was no one who could tell me about that either. So I had to really imagine that. I found the experience at first very terrifying and then kind of liberating. And in many ways, I think it gave me a lot of courage as a writer to feel that I could do that as long as I let my reader know this is what I'm doing. But I think maybe you and I are both heading into the land of fiction next. And so for me, that experience of exploring writing in a fictional mode, I think gave me some feeling that I could do that in the future. Yeah, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the most difficult experiences that you had was sort of trying to get through school, and part of that had to do with the problem that you couldn't see, which of course is terrible, and then which eventually, well, I won't, no spoilers, but at one point you were enrolled in Hunter at Hunter College, and then you made a decision that you would leave, and which is a decision that I think must have been very, very difficult for you because, well, your brothers had already gone through school, and so much of the American experience is about, go to school, get a good job, success. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that decision that you made to leave and how that happened and how it affected your relationship with your different family members.
Absolutely. I think it was at that point where I felt like a complete failure in my life. Because my father didn't allow me the glasses that I so desperately needed in order to see, my grades plummeted for years. And there was a point in which my brother bought me a box of contacts and I was able to see for a little bit, but I still failed because I had suffered from major depression, given the circumstances of my life. And yeah, I reached this point where I was just so full of just anger and resentment for my parents, for their neglect, and for my brothers for seemingly abandoning me. And I just reached a point where I didn't want to blame them anymore. And I made this decision to drop out because I felt that if I could fail on my own terms, not on anybody else's, not because somebody didn't allow me glasses, but if I could just fail on my own terms, then I could perhaps succeed on my own terms as well. I think I owe much of my happiness to that pivotal decision because I was able to really take back the helm of my life, and it allowed me to remove some of that deep-seated resentment that I had harbored against my parents for the neglect. And I now have a very loving relationship with them all that I really cherish.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it's very, I think with immigrant families, I think what you're getting at is that there really is this clash between the generations. The adults come to the United States and perceive the world through the framework of what they grew up with and what they've always known. And then for you as the child, you're tossed into America and to New York, and you have to make a new path. And so I think that's a very interesting way. I mean, it's and it's interesting that you've been able to place it in this very positive framework that most people, I think, would not be able to do. So it's quite interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, it came from, there was a lot of negativity beforehand, but I think through sort of an attempt to understand my father's past and to really uncover all that he had been through and understand his suffering. And in so doing, I was able to really cultivate compassion, not just for him, but for myself as well. You know, so early on, especially for children of immigrants, we see the fallibility of our parents as children, and it becomes increasingly difficult as we grow up to really navigate and reconcile that fallibility with your own knowledge of the world and how to navigate it yourself.
I think I had that with my mother, in the sense that my mother remained in many ways European in her outlook, and you know, really till the end of her life. Although she was she had become an American and certainly was very much a New Yorker. But I think in so many ways, you know, her soul was European, and her way of looking at the world, and also her approach to parenting was quite traditional. It was the way that she had been parented herself. And so I think it was something that she never could really, she couldn't make that shift to, you know, looking at the world the way that a child would in a very, very different culture where the rules are completely different. So I think that's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I had to do, in order to reach a point of understanding that I did, I had to do a lot of research. And I'm wondering, you also had to do a lot of research for your memoir. I'm wondering how that research, especially into anti-Semitism in the 20s and the 30s, how did that affect how you see the world today?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is that I was working on this book during a time when, you know, really to my shock and amazement, I saw this kind of anti-immigrant language start to resurface again in political discourse. And particularly what was really shocking to me was the revival of this idea, America First. It's interesting that you brought up the idea of the American dream, which of course has changed over time, and it's been many, many things over time. But this America First idea, I didn't realize until I started doing this research, that this idea of America First has been around almost since the beginning of the country's founding. And tragically, it has always, always been a very anti-immigrant concept. So it was always a way of defining who's American, who belongs here, who doesn't belong here. And typically, America First was the slogan for people who maybe themselves had been immigrants, or maybe their parents, and now they felt secure, we're Americans. And then they're trying to slam the door against the next wave of people who are trying to come. So when in 2016, when you started to hear America First again, I was really very alarmed, because this was absolutely what was going on here in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. This is the reason why the immigration quotas were so terrible, that when Jews were trying to desperately leave Europe, they couldn't come here. There's laws that passed in 1924 that really limited these quotas terribly. And then the same thing, of course, was going on in Europe. It wasn't called America First, but it was the same idea of, you know, national purity, and that's basically the fascist message. So it was all happening while I was doing that research, and it was so upsetting and shocking to see it, that to see the parallels, I couldn't avoid seeing those parallels. And you know, I certainly hope that that immigrant stories will continue to be told, because it's so important for people to see that in every generation, people have to leave. You know, there's war, there's famine, there's all kinds of hardship, and that kind of restrictive approach to immigration is really, you know, is adding to the suffering of so many people. So I was wondering, in framing your book, I've been curious, did you sort of know where you were going to end it, where you were going to land? or I mean, from the beginning, or did that sort of creep up on you? Because I think sometimes with memoir, it's helpful to know maybe where you're going, but I'm wondering if you had that sense of where you were going to end and why you chose to stop where you did.
Yeah. So what's funny about that last chapter is that it was one of the first chapters that I wrote. And when I first embarked on this journey to write my memoir, and I think I wrote it first because I knew that that's where I wanted to write myself to, not just in the memoir, but in my life. I think in many ways I was still living the life that I was writing about, and I was still emerging from my depression, emerging from darkness. And I knew that, okay, I'm setting out to write this memoir. I don't know what that journey is going to look like, but I know that this is where I want to end. I want to end on, well, I don't want to spoil anything, but it was really difficult to, it was one of the most challenging things to write this memoir, to still live that life. I'm still in the same apartment building that I immigrated to in 1993. And my parents live on the third floor, whereas I live on the second floor. And so it's lovely to be close to my parents, close to my family. But at the same time, I have a very complicated relationship with my parents, as you know. And so not only were they upstairs in my mind metaphorically, but they were also upstairs physically. And I really needed that distance in order to write the memoir, but I had no choice. So I used that last chapter as sort of this beacon of light to write towards, and to work through a lot of the trauma and a lot of my struggles. And I think it was ultimately successful, and I wrote myself to that different place in my life.
That is so interesting, because I think, we, when we approach memoirs, I mean, you sort of think of that as a storytelling. For me, I mean, I wrote myself to the end, but I didn't actually know because of everything that was happening politically in the country. I really honestly wasn't sure how things would work. So I was kind of almost waiting for the moment, for that moment to appear where I would say, okay, now I know where it will stop. And I actually had to write the ending many times. So it was a different thing. But similar to you, I think you work out a lot of problems when you write a memoir. I mean, maybe you start it in that way to sort of heal yourself or try to find out the mysteries of your family. But ultimately, I think when you gift that to the world, to other readers, then you're letting them experience that as well. It doesn't matter if their personal story is different. They can just see that you went on that journey and that you got to where you needed to go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Speaking of gifts to the world, I think your memoir is such a gift to the world. It's so beautiful, and it tells a really rich and important story. So I'm wondering, what contribution do you see for your book as part of Jewish history and the Holocaust?
Yeah, I feel that, we're living in a time where I think we're starting to see how a lot of women's stories have not been seen and recognized. And, a lot of the stories that have come out of, I mean, most of the stories that came out of World War II and the Holocaust were, either heroics, but you didn't hear a lot about just women who were mothers and daughters who were trying to make the best of a situation. And I think we're in a time now where we're starting to I think it's a wonderful thing that we're starting to hear more stories about women's lives. And that's really what I hope, is that this will be part of the general narration of the Holocaust and looking deeper into it. One of the things that was just moved me so deeply was that all the researchers who helped me, because I had a lot of help. I'm not a trained historian, so I basically sought out allies to help me with the work. But they were so generous with their time. And the other thing that really stunned me was that there are so many people who are still looking at this time period and doing such intense work in it. And they were so generous to share all that with me. So I hope that my story will add to an understanding of how people lived, how Jews lived in Vienna and Austria before the Holocaust began. A very rich life, life with a very, very deep culture, music, art, science, education. It was 10% of the population of Vienna was Jewish, but they had a very outsized influence in terms of the general culture. And then how abruptly all that ended, and to really look at individual lives and hope that that will shed light on the broader story of the Holocaust.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's a story that will resonate with many people. And this time period still affects a lot of people for sure. And
Absolutely.
I mean, and even for me, I'm not Jewish, but what resonated most to me was, like you said, you're telling the story of these women's lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love the way that you talk about your relationship with your mother, how candidly you speak about that, and then sort of that bridge to your relationship with your own daughter at the time, and how you're uncovering your mother's past while also cultivating this relationship with your daughter, which at turns was also complicated, and it. Yeah, and in my own story too, I speak a lot about my father, but my mother is also a very integral part of my life, and my relationship with her has really informed the way that I look at the world. So I think, yeah, you did such a beautiful job, fleshing this relationship.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this intergenerational kind of narrative is so important, because I think what most people don't quite understand about the immigrant experience is that the trauma that a person suffers really does kind of pass down. And until you sort of grapple with it and understand it, it will keep passing its way down. And I think that, war, we understand that war is a traumatic experience for the people, for the combatants, but also for all the civilians and the children. And you carry it with you, even though your family left the scene of war. You're bringing all that with you when you arrive in a new country, and so I think that's very important to think about. I think that the two stories have that very much in common. So I'm wondering then if there seem to be quite a lot of questions. So I was hoping that maybe Helen will come back and help us sort through.
Yeah, so I would ask, there's some comments here, but I will ask if you would be kind enough to put your questions in the chat. And while we're waiting for you to do that, I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you both based on what you've told us this evening. And thank you for sharing everything that you shared. This was basically, I mean, both of you have both the books are very different, but they have these tremendous similarities in that you're giving us an account of your experience. Both of you wrote about your families, and both of you wrote about your mothers in particular. From a writing exercise standpoint, how did you step back far enough from that to gain perspective? And what was that exercise for both of you to try and represent your parents as honestly as you could, and not just from your own personal perspective? I'd love to hear what you both have to say about that. Julie, can we start with you?
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, in a way, my complicated relationship with my mother was really the beginning of wanting to write the book in the first place. I really did want to wrestle with that and understand it. And I think as a writer, I think, I wrote a lot of drafts, and then I think it's really always in that editing process. I don't know if Lee will agree with that there, but it was really in the editing process that you start sifting through and picking out really the true moments where you feel that you've captured something very particular about the relationship that we had together. Once I started, I think it's also true that once you start thinking about the past that way, you start remembering sometimes even just very prosaic moments in the family, like a certain dinner, a certain conversation that happened, a certain day at school, and how all of that, the conflict kind of manifested. So I think it really happened where I drafted a lot and only the little nuggets remain. So
that's really, yeah. I had a similar process. I mean, I had many drafts in the beginning, and actually my first few drafts were utterly depressing. I don't know if it's the same for you, but I think it was very few moments of light. It was full of darkness. And I think part of that process was just sort of getting all of it out of me, getting all of that darkness out of me, and then taking a step back and thinking finally of all the moments of brightness in our lives, because life, there are moments of laughter, moments of sunshine, and after I was able to get all of that out of my system, I was able to infuse the narrative with all of this positivity. I mean, it's still fairly sad, but there is a lot of hope and optimism there. And I think I was only able to do that through the act of writing. So if Julie, this is the same for you, but for me, writing is sort of, it's a source of healing, and it was in many ways my salvation. Yeah.
I mean, that passage that you read at the very beginning of our conversation here, the scene at the beach is really such a beautiful moment of family, of a day with your family. And it was such a precious day because your family was working all the time, trying just to make enough to eat. And that you remember this beautiful day at the beach is just really, I think it makes it all the more haunting that it remains so clear. I have moments like that I remember from childhood, just with my mom in the kitchen. A lot of the memories have to do with food because my mom loved to cook. And so there was a lot of time in that kitchen. And so, you sort of have to savor those special memories in the midst of times that were often very difficult. So I think that, yeah.
Thank you for that. There's a question. Oh, I'm sorry, Lee.
No. I was just going to ask a follow-up, if I may.
Yes,
please do.
Do you think that it was easier to write this now after after your mother has passed away? And
sometimes I have regret that I didn't have an opportunity to ask my mother for more stories, but I also do wonder if I would have been able to write this book if she were still alive. Sometimes in my case, because she's gone, at times I almost had, it got a little seance-y. I don't know how else to describe it, but almost as if there were these clues. She left all these documents and papers and photographs, and I really did have the feeling that they were left there for a reason, that I was supposed to do something with them. And sometimes I wondered, would she be mad at me? Am I doing it all wrong? Am I telling the story all wrong? Or have what I hope I've done is given light to a very dark time and shown, as in your story, just the incredible resilience that of people who really just were determined to survive and live. Yeah.
We have a question from Amy for Lee. Do you plan to pursue writing and being an author full time? And if so, Which genre will you focus on?
Yes, I think, from reading that the Blue Sky in the ninth grade and finding the courage to tell my own story, and also the fact that storytelling has always been such a big part of my life and has been in many ways a coping mechanism for me to get through some pretty dark times. I do think that at least I hope to be an author full time, and I think, as Julie mentioned before, I think we're both going to venture into the land of fiction for our
Land of fiction. And you'll do it really well. Kim mentioned here also to Julie, absolutely, about your mother. Kim said she guided you to write your family story, which it sounds like she did. Lee, I have a question for you. Was there anybody, you talk about the difficulties you faced in school, was there anyone with whom you bonded outside of your family who helped you through the most difficult times that you remember?
Absolutely. There's so many, actually. Similar to Julie's story and how she met all these wonderful people who were so giving and generous of their time to help her do her research. I find that I owe so much to so many people that I've met along the way who were able to fill in the gaps that my parents couldn't. And so teachers, for instance, my fourth grade teacher was just such a positive influence on my life. I mean, she would come to school dressed up like a princess, and I remember just, coming from my background, doing the sweatshop labor, and then going to school and seeing this teacher who was so full of life and so full of love for her students. And I gravitated towards her. And then later on, when my eyesight really failed me in high school, my English teachers were all such wonderful people. And Miss Lou, for instance, you've read about her, but she was my English teacher, and she really helped me when I needed help. And she really helped cultivate this love of literature that I now have, and that has really kind of just gotten me through some really sad times.
Yeah. I mean, also then, later on, I think you were so fortunate to have mentors who helped guide you to get where you are now. I mean, I wonder if it might be hard to imagine when you look back on the 9-year-old you who couldn't see, to imagine that you managed to get through college and thrive, and it's kind of incredible. It's sometimes I think we when you look back on your childhood self, you can give them a hug, because I think it's that they're the tough times, but I think you showed a lot of strength to get through all that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I view a lot of these people as, like guardian angels who just appeared when I really needed it.
Wonderful. Julie, during the course of your research, and actually just during the course of writing the book in general, were there any surprises? Was there something that jumped out at you that you never expected to, whether it was learning something about your mother or a chance encounter with some of the people that helped you with your research?
Well, there were a lot of those. Sometimes when I say that things got a little seance-y, I guess that's what I mean. I almost felt sometimes that I would look through the same photographs that were part of the family album 20 times. And then one day I would look through the same photographs and out would pop one that I had never noticed that was somehow just what I needed. At one point in the book, I did connect with a person who ended up helping me in ways I could not possibly imagine. I wanted to mention that there was a story that my mother always told us, which was that her father made an object in his factory that she always said saved his life. And this is the little object. It's these paper fan. She would always say it was made of paper, shaped like a fan, And what it was used for was that they put powdered medicine into each of these little channels. And she would say that somehow this thing saved her father from deportation. So I wanted to find it if I could, but I had never seen it before. And this man whom I met, thank you, Internet, ended up finding it for me. And when I saw it, it was really one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen in my life. He mailed it to me when he located it. And he also located the factory that is still making this object. And this really just kind of blew me away, because it was sort of this mythical item from my childhood. You know, when you have sort of a story that just seems impossible and incredible, and then suddenly it was real. And that was a very beautiful thing for me as a human, but of course also as a writer.
What a wonderful story.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little message here from Michelle P, and I don't know who it's for, but it says, "You were just as amazing as you are today," and a big heart. So I don't know who, but
teacher.
Is it?
Yes, that's my child.
Oh, that's so great.
You and I are
nice.
friends now.
So if you have, now is the time to fill in your last questions for Julie and Ly. My last question to you both is, where did you meet and how did you become friends? Did you bond over these books, or tell us the story?
I don't know.
Well, we met at a residency called Yaddo, and I guess it was summer of 2019.
Yeah.
And so it was that last summer before everything got crazy. But I remember you read some of your chapters that evening, and I immediately felt just so connected to your work, because even though it was about this world that I've never been to and never seen, I could really relate to the emotional world that you were creating. So yeah, we became friends. You know, you eat meals together. You spend your day slaving over your pages in private agony. And then you come together for meals, and I felt like we really connected while we were there. Yeah.
It also helps that we live somewhat close to each other.
Yeah.
Sometimes makes her way down to New York City, and we, it's just, I love our relationship. And I think Julie were you the only other memoirist there? I mean,
there weren't that many of us that time. Yeah. There were a lot of poets, a lot of novelists. Yeah. And so I think it's, it's hard when you're writing a memoir. I think sometimes you struggle with feeling that you should be able to do this, that you have the expertise to write about your life, or that your life is even all that interesting, or that your family's life is all that interesting. So when you meet another memoirist whom you know is going through the same struggles, it's very bonding.
Yeah.
So,
I can see that. I was going to say, how do you work off a memoir? I mean, it's pretty hard, right? You could have somebody critique.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if we have no more questions, I would like to thank you both for sharing your wonderful stories. For those of you who have not read the books, please, I can't encourage you to do so enough. Signed copies of Eva and Eve, I apologize for getting that wrong at the beginning, and House of Sticks are available at oblongbooks.com. And thank you, Keanu. I'm glad you're ordering your copies today. I'd like to express our thanks to Michelle Chung and Mia O'Neill of Simon & Schuster and Fallon Kirby of Atria Books, who helped make this event possible this evening. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Ly. And thanks to all of you who took time out of your evening to join us on Crowdcast. We've had a wonderful evening. I wish you all good night and be well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. Take care. Bye.
Bye.